Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I'm your host, Eleanor Barrett. Today, we'll be speaking with Sarah Paoletti, a practice professor of law and director of the Transnational Legal Clinic, about where immigration law and policy may be headed under the incoming Trump administration. To start off, could you give us a snapshot of immigration in the U.S.? How many people enter legally and how many enter illegally?
So I'll start with the first question. The second question is a little bit more difficult. On the first question, in 2014, we had 180 million non-immigrant admissions into the United States. So that's individuals who are coming, either Canadians, right? Canadians crossing the border, Mexican border crossings, Mexican border card crossers who come across for work and return home at night. But then approximately 75 million of those are your typical non-immigrant visas. So your tourist visas, your people who come for short-term business, temporary workers, students, and related categories. And then you have the numbers of immigrants who come on as sort of enter through family-based petitions or other petitions that allow for lawful permanent residency. So it's a significant number, but not significant in terms of the overall population of the United States. The question of how many enter unlawfully is obviously a much harder question to answer because they're not detected. And also harder to answer because many of the people who are in the country unlawfully have entered lawfully. So they've come on a tourist visa or they've come on a work visa and their visa overstays. And so it's hard to calculate. But the research indicates that there are about 11.1 million undocumented individuals in the United States as of 2014, which is the last set of numbers that we have, which is a decrease from the 12.2 million that we had in 2007. And studies show that that number is sort of on a either holding steady or on a decline.
Well, what do we know about the nationality or nationalities that make up this undocumented population? Do we know, where they come from and also why they're entering and staying beyond their authorization?
So the majority, although the minority majority, about 54% of the Mexican or 52% of the undocumented population is from Mexico. That, again, is a decline from 2009. And we've seen an uptake in undocumented immigrants from Asia, from Central America, and a smaller number, but still an uptick from sub-Saharan Africa. As to why they are coming, I think there's a range of answers to that, right? And this goes to immigration more generally. For some, it's joining family members. For some, it is insecurity in their home country and their home community. And that could be insecurity for the Central Americans, the rash of gang violence that we're seeing, and other forms of violence and political repression that is following some of that, and destabilization in countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, certainly is playing into the number of undocumented immigrants we're seeing from there. Humanitarian crises that we're seeing in places like Haiti, but also Central America and Sub-Saharan Africa and other places that are environmental humanitarian crises, not necessarily humanitarian crises that allow one to gain refugee status or asylum status. But an interesting statistic from the Pew Research Center is that approximately 2/3 of all adults who are living in the United States unlawfully have been here for 10 years or more.
Interesting. Well, what about just one other area? We hear a lot in the news about people coming from the Middle East. That's a hot topic. Is there any evidence in the research that that's happening, or is it more of a discussion point and anticipated to happen based on the situation there and events in the Middle East?
So it's more of a discussion point, and certainly in looking at sort of the issue of Syria, right? If we talk about the Syrian refugees, which is a topic hotly debated during the election, sure. And Trump's allegations of the percentage fold at which President Clinton and Secretary Clinton were looking to increase immigration. Those numbers are actually relatively small, right? Our refugee admissions are small numbers. And in reality, I don't think we're seeing those numbers just because physically getting to the United States, right, you have to enter through an airport, right? You have to enter by air. And that is significantly more challenging if you don't have some sort of visa to get here.
Okay, well, let's turn to the election. What are the key differences between now President Obama and President-elect Trump as they relate to immigration?
So I'll start by saying that President Obama, again, despite some of the rhetoric during the election, President Obama has a very mixed immigration record. He certainly, on the, I would say, sort of positive side, instituted deferred action for childhood arrivals, which looked to provide some sort of lawful presence to individuals who came as kids, were brought here by their parents, came as children, were in school, were pursuing school, allowed them to continue to pursue school and also get work authorization, which allowed them to fund school. So that positive, right?
Are those the people that are commonly referred to as the Dreamers, or is that a different? Okay,
yes. Yeah. So they're commonly referred to as the Dreamers because the DREAM Act never passed. President Obama, through his executive authority, decided to issue what's called prosecutorial discretion. So we decide not to prosecute these individuals for their unlawful presence. Instead, we say, we're exercising our discretion. We're going to recognize that you're here, allow you to stay, and give you work authorization while you're here. Okay. He also sought to extend that to deferred action for parents, right, where they had U.S. citizen children, and you have many mixed status families where you have undocumented parents or an undocumented parent, and granting them sort of a lawful presence through deferred action, right, or prosecutorial discretion, and allowing them to have work authorization. But also it meant that parents of citizen children could go to their parent-teacher conferences, right, attend church, take their kids to the hospital, all of those day-to-day activities that parents engage in without fear of deportation. Nonetheless, we saw the greatest increase in deportations under President Obama than we have under any other administration. In practice, it's been sort of targeting people with criminal records, but those criminal records have been from minor to violent, right? And so it hasn't necessarily been just going after violent criminals in the enforced increase in deportations. The other thing that we've seen under President Obama is a resurgence of detention of children and families, and so mothers and kids. And so just here outside of Philadelphia, at Berks, we have the Berks Family Residential Center, which is housing children and mothers. Some of them have been there for more than a year while they pursue their asylum applications. So this notion that President Obama is kind of the amnesty president or easy on unlawful immigration is simply a false notion that hasn't played out in his policies over his administration. Now, President-elect Trump has been much more hostile in his rhetoric towards immigrants, and has, initially it was going to be a ban on all Muslims. He's backed down on that a little bit and now talking about extreme vetting of Muslims, and I can talk about that some more. And now he's also saying instead of deporting all 11.1 undocumented individuals, he's realizing sort of the impracticality of that, I think. And we're going to go after the criminals. And again, we'll see kind of how that plays out.
Well, what does that mean? I mean, in practical terms, how would this proposal to go after the criminals, and I think the number in the press is 3 million undocumented workers, what does that mean in practice? And does that reflect, is it just a rhetorical shift, as you suggested, or are there going to be more substantive impacts for the people who are here in the country, do you think?
I think we don't know the answer to that yet. We don't know the answer to that yet. I'll say that his advisors on immigration come from sort of the anti-immigration or immigration restrictionist wing of the immigration policy arena. So the Center for Immigration Studies has been advising, and they're very much in favor of strict controls on immigration and severe restrictions on immigration. Chris Kobach is on the transition team, and his name is being tossed around as possible Attorney General. He is the author of the legislation in Hazleton that was struck down by the Third Circuit. He's responsible for SB 1070, which was a similar legislation in Arizona that the courts struck down. So I think we are seeing a move towards looking for more ways to deem people criminal, right? Because immigration is a civil law,
Sure.
right? And so unlawful presence is a civil law violation. And so they're trying, I think there's a greater move towards criminalization of immigration and immigration violations, and we'll see sort of how that plays out over time.
Well, you mentioned as one of President Obama's more pro-immigration policies, deferred action or prosecutorial discretion applied to children in particular who are here. Do we have a sense of what's coming for that? That's, I believe, an executive action that probably could be rescinded sooner, right, than some of the other immigration policies in place.
And so Trump has said that he is going to rescind all executive orders. He specifically talked about DACA and DAPA in that. I think in practice, rescission is harder. I think what most people are expecting is rather than rescind, it simply won't be renewed. So somebody's DACA status has to get renewed. And that renewal happens on a regular basis. And so when that renewal comes up, it won't be renewed. And if their DACA status gets renewed, their work authorization status won't get renewed. So I think we're expecting that to be sort of a trickle off, a rolling change in status, but we really don't know what to expect.
Okay. Well, another hot topic in the campaign certainly is this idea of sanctuary cities. And is there any firm sense or even a general sense of what's going to happen? First of all, what is a sanctuary city? Can you give us a brief description and then explain to us what the effects of this election will be on that concept?
Sure. So sanctuary cities are cities where the local government basically says, we will not voluntarily turn over individuals who we encounter to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so we will not, when we get a witness to a crime, turn that individual over. And we will not cooperate unless we will not cooperate with ICE in enforcing federal immigration law, right? So they're saying we as localities have our own set of laws that we need to worry about and we need to enforce and we need to protect our communities. In doing so, we recognize the importance of treating undocumented individuals the same way we treat all of our other residents. And the federal government is responsible for enforcing immigration laws. They're free to do so, but we're not going to facilitate that process. Recently, Mayor Kinney, because Philadelphia is a sanctuary city, and Mayor Kinney came out and said, we can call it a sanctuary city or we can call it a Fourth Amendment city. We're a Fourth Amendment city, right? So unless you have a warrant to arrest this individual, we're not going to turn this person over into your custody. And so I think that's an interesting way to think about it. Ultimately, it's a question as to what economic impact that will have on cities, right? At what point will the federal government decide to withhold any of the sort of federal monies that flow to states?
And can they do that? Can the federal government just withhold money as retaliation to is there I mean, it seems like there would be possibly several legal challenges to that kind of an action. Do we have a sense of whether it's possible?
I think it is. I think anything's possible in this era. I mean, there is precedent for this, right, in the context of road safety laws, right?
Sure.
And so if you don't if you don't implement and enforce certain road safety laws, your federal transportation dollars can be withheld. So there
isn't there I mean, not to get into an extended discussion, but isn't there contrary precedent, for example, with the healthcare exchanges, right? Isn't there some precedent in the healthcare cases saying that the government can't coerce the states into enacting these exchanges?
Right, and I think it's an interesting area because we're seeing a shift from, I think historically we had been arguing plenary powers and the federal government and only the federal government can enforce immigration laws. And we were doing so in reaction to local laws like the Hazleton Law and SB 1070 in Arizona. And now we're having to shift to say, actually, that power rests with the states and the localities. To not enforce, right, to protect our citizens. So it's a little bit different, a little bit different framing, but it is a shift in framing that folks are having to do. And I think all of this is a gray area. So we don't really know until we move forward how it's really going to play
Well,
out.
do we have any sense about other visa programs? One that comes up a lot is the concept of an H-1B visa. Will you briefly explain what that is and tell us if there are any implications for that in this recent election?
So I think, the visa category issue is, we'll see, right? We'll see what happens. The H-1Bs are visas for individuals with certain skills, right? They come in, and they have been used for a variety of reasons. They've been used, among other things, to bring in teachers to teach in our schools where we don't have U.S. workers to teach in our schools. And so I think we have to look carefully at the H-1B visa programs. What impact this will all have on the H-1B, I don't know. I don't think that's really an area that has been carefully explored. I think what we have to be careful of is to make sure that as there's a growing restriction on immigration and means of lawful entry and means of legalizing, that visa categories such as the H-1B aren't used as a means to exploit non-citizen workers.
Well, you mentioned earlier this concept of extreme vetting of potential Muslim immigrants. What does that mean? Are there prospects that will happen? And what are the broader implications of that for both immigration law and broader immigration policy?
So I don't actually know what it means to say extreme vetting. It's a nice, not a nice, but it's a tool, it's a term that's been used, it's been thrown around, extreme vetting. There already is significant vetting of all immigrants who enter the United States by the State Department, by the Department of Homeland Security. If they're coming in on a labor visa, there's vetting by the Department of Labor on sort of whether or not those visas should be issued. So there already is significant vetting of the process. Now, what additional vetting there would be, I don't know.
Do we have any precedent in current law or policy, I guess in current law, for additional vetting for certain types of people who enter the country? Or are the procedures mostly uniform across all people who enter the country?
So I would say the processing is not particularly transparent, right?
Okay.
So it'd be hard to really say what's going on internally. I don't know of, I'm sure there are. I have not participated in any FOIA studies to see what happens behind the scenes, right, when you submit the application. I think the precedent that we have for additional levels of review are when there's the possibility of a material support bar for admission. So where somebody is believed to be or accused of having given material support to a terrorist organization, right? They go off for additional vetting, right? Vetting solely based on identity and religion is something that I think is unprecedented in this country, and something that is challengeable and should be challenged and will be challenged, I'm sure, on a host of constitutional grounds. There's certainly grounds under international law for challenging that. I think the trick always when you're dealing with immigration law is the notion of plenary powers and the rights that a country has to decide who comes in and who doesn't come in. And there's broad discretion granted to the federal government in making those decisions. When those decisions are made on purely discriminatory grounds, you have a greater chance of a successful challenge. Where those grounds are mixed, right, where they try to make the argument for national security purposes, then it's up to lawyers and law students and advocates to really challenge the factual assumptions that underlie those bans. But that's going to be kind of a fight, I think, moving forward, and we'll see how far all of that actually gets.
We've talked a lot about changes and what might be likely to happen. Let's dream for a minute. What, in your view, would effective immigration reform look like, whether or not that's likely to happen soon? Just operating in a vacuum, what would be the best reform measures, you think?
Operating in a vacuum. So a very challenging question, I think, right? That is the perennial question of comprehensive immigration reform. And I think immigration reform to be effective has to be truly comprehensive, which is one of the reasons why I feel like we haven't gotten immigration reform, right? Because when you're talking about immigration, you're talking often about a symptom, not the initial action, right? So immigration is a symptom of our trade policies. Immigration is a symptom, honestly, of global climate change, where communities are now living in drought and families are having to leave their communities to find food. Immigration is a symptom of urbanization and moves to cities and lack of job opportunities in cities, which then push people out of their home communities looking for better opportunities. Immigration is a symptom of political instability that's caused by foreign policy and trade and everything else, right? So I think it's very hard to think about effective immigration reform without recognizing that immigration is part of a much broader system. That said, in the ideal world, we have an immigration system that respects the human rights, the fundamental human rights of all individuals, regardless of their migration status, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their religion, regardless of their political identity, regardless of their sexual orientation, right? So you'll have a system that recognizes the right of children who have been here to be here, right? That we recognize the contribution of individuals, that we recognize and protect the right to family life. And so that in doing so, we recognize the importance of not interfering with the family, not detaining a mother or a father 5, 6, 12 hours away from their family, taking away the breadwinner from their family, right? Looking for ways to meaningfully integrate the population that is here into society and looking for means to deal with the backlog in the immigration system so that we can process our asylum applications more quickly. We can process the family-based petitions more effectively and efficiently, which will mean an increase in the numbers that are allocated to individuals who are allowed to be here. And a system that respects the due process rights of individuals. So we don't see home raids, we don't see workplace raids without warrants, right? So that's just a small start.
Okay, well, thanks so much, and thanks for your time today, giving us a head start on what's to come in immigration law and policy in the new Trump administration.
Great, thank you.